roundtable later on as well to try and get your thoughts about this. The question is, there's a lot of people in this room who've been looking at realism for a long time, trying to reorient it. And the problem is we're not a school. Right? We're not a coherent school in the way that, say, the neoclassical realists are, or the long-established neo-realists are. So how do we form a strategy as a group of people interested in this? In other words, how do we get out, how do we strategize our way out of the cul-de-sac? So we can say to Daniel, the challenge to you and to all of us is to you brought up the idea of the Morgenthal's theorist versus Morgenthal's thinker. How do we essentially, bearing in mind that we're all a disparate group of individuals, how do we form a strategy to get out of that cul-de-sac? And that applies also to Tim Luke as well. Any ideas on getting out of the fact that we aren't a school? How does a non-school group of scholars work their way out? Because we can't profess a true faith like the neo-realists. We can't profess a true faith like the neoclassical realists. How do we proceed in the absence of homogeneity?
Tim, do you want to go first?
I think to a certain extent, a school, the way a lot of a school in a sense would require historically some a shared site, a shared problem, a shared network that is often caught in explaining a particular problem, which in the case of Morgenthau, I think was very much caught up in the Cold War and the if you will, border wars between the Soviet Union and the United States, particularly Vietnam. So finding some concrete problem and getting out there to frame the debate, lead the debate, structure the debate about how it can be understood in a way that is better than that offered by alternative frameworks, be one way of starting a school. But I think also in many ways a school is created by people collaborating together in the common production of not necessarily an identical, but a shared set of perspectives look at these kinds of grounded problems. That might be a start.
What part of what we think of, what we see as school may be the opposite solution where we are. And I just point that out to us. The second thing is, I think part of the problem we have, when I went back and I looked at these scholars and how they came to the consensus about what they were talking about, that it's possible for their knowledge to cohere, notwithstanding the work that people like Nicolas Hulot have been showing us how grant money from Rockefeller Center helped create a school simply by creating a base and funds the school that happened, is that there was a kind of substrate of knowledge about how the 20 years crisis happened in the first place that a lot of people seem to share. Right, it's an argument about that was bounded on the one hand by someone like Keynes, on the other hand by someone like Carl Friedrich, and so on and so on and so on. And I think they sort of all had that. I think that they thought they basically understood what the crisis potential for their era was. I don't think that we all immediately know that quite as well. And so our problem for creating a school is that, well, we may agree on the crisis, but we may not agree on why quite as much. There may not be as much of that consensus. The third thing to think about for strategy, and here's the most practical of the three. I told you it was a disjointed answer with 3 parts. And here, scholarship in the UK is particularly important. Patrick Jackson has recently argued that the American IR types have to get out under the veil of that. So anyway, my point's been made, right? I'm not sure if the school back then was as much of a school as we think it is. Two, I don't think there's the consensus and the mastery over a common body of social theory. And three, if we do want to develop a strategy, I think it involves taking the field away from, taking IR out of its role as it is in the US of being a subfield of political science. You know, returning it to that earlier era where it was a kind of standing interdisciplinary community. I think APS has had a very baleful effect on the pluralism within our discipline.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question. We give it a try by Bill Schreiman. Bill?
Yeah, hi, Tim. It's nice to meet you, only virtually, and Dan, it's nice to hear and see you again. Question for each one of you. Enjoy the presentations. Tim, I'm frustrated in general as an outsider somewhat to IR critical theory about the amorphous way in which the term critical theory gets tossed about. It seems to me in all sorts of different things, and sometimes the result doesn't mean very much, it seems to me. What I liked about your presentation at the beginning, you referred to specific traditions of critical theory, neo-Marxism, Frankfurt School, etc. However, I thought by the end of the presentation it had become much broader, and you mentioned post-structuralism, some other critical traditions. I mean, how useful is it to think about or to talk about critical theory in this broad and I think maybe overly amorphous way? What are the limitations to that? And it seems to me your specific references, I mean, C. Wright Mills is there, he's a Weberian Marxist. I mean, there's a specific tradition I thought in general you were relying on, but then you seem to move to as many people in IR theory seem to do, to a broader conception of theory. So that would be my question to you. And I guess for Dan, maybe it's a related question. I mean, I'm also interested, obviously, in critical theory and realism. I mean, it struck me so many of your criticisms of Morgenthau, I think, are perfectly sensible. I bet many of us in the room agreed with what you had to say about Morgenthau. Maybe this is wrong, but I suspect a number of people would. You know, do you need Adorno to do that? I have to say, I couldn't see, and it struck me that there's maybe a level problem. I mean, you know, Adorno, you get this brilliant critique of a certain kind of science, a brilliant critique of the limitations of conceptual thought. That is a very radical, it's fine, right, but a very radical sort of epistemological argument which, you know, to move from that to the specifics of Morgenthau's views, I mean, there's a transition there. I don't know, I mean, I see how you're admirably trying to do that, but I mean, part of me wants to say, look, you could use Adorno to take on basically all of IR. I mean, Morgenthau would just be, you know, one part of the story. Maybe that's what you want to do, but you seem to be very interested legitimately in making these specific arguments in response to Morgenthau. But to do that, I don't really see how you ultimately, you know, if your worries about his inadequate view of the world state, his lack of reflection about that. I mean, I don't know why you need Adorno to do that. Thank you.
Tim, do you want to go first?
Okay. Yes, I mean, I think in talking about critical theory, I most likely dispositionally would favor going with a Marxian, neo-Marxian, some elements of the Frankfurt School, which are speaking to many of the same sorts of problems in the same historical context that Morgenthau was working in. Then I guess with a thought about to what extent our shared dissatisfaction with the way a lot of IR theory is unfolding today, let's say, being willing to include others that are critical of the existing canons, schools, networks of IR theory, but who would not necessarily want to identify themselves with a Marxian or a neo-Marxian position, but I think have a very grounded sense of the whatever the limits, but also the strengths of the way that Morgenthau So I think, yes, from my foundational perspective, I'm more in the Marxian, neo-Marxian frame of mind, but I think there are critical perspectives or critical ideas that we can bring in from other approaches today that we would like to have in the mix of thinking about this kind of neoclassical realism.
Okay, thank you very much. Daniel?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Bill, for that question. And yeah, I do think I need Adorno, and so let me take your question in sort of three quick parts. The first one is, couldn't you take on all of IR this way? And I think the answer is yeah. I mean, that's what my book does, right? I mean, there's sort of 3.5 chapters of different schools of IR, different traditions in IR, and their ability or non-ability, their ability or their desire versus their ability to take on a certain kind of reflexivity that they know themselves. They, in discussion with themselves or with others, admit they need, but can't sustain. And when I look at the guy who's trying to take seriously how you write social science with that kind of reflexivity, it brings me back to Adorno. It brings me back not to the, and this I think is the second point, not the angry cultural Mandarin Adorno who hates jazz, right, and wants to throw bottles into the ocean, right? The Adorno that wrote the F scale, right? The Adorno that collaborated with Paul Lazarsfeld. The Adorno that spent a lot of time in the negative dialectics talking about Weber, right? That guy has, I think, and this reading can be contested, but there's folks on my side, though I think we are a plurality in the field, that think that he understands the necessity of an administered society very well. He doesn't think that there's a quick or an easy solution for it, so we have to kind of keep on with it. And because we have to keep on with this thing, and because the attempt to administer politics is precisely what's implicated in the genocidal projects of the 20th century, we have to have a very deep notion of reflexivity, and I think that his is the hardest case of all, right? If you can do that, reflexivity, and still be doing something like practical IR, well, then you're going to satisfy all comers, and I think you're going to be closest to answering the actual problems of thinking practically in the wake of Auschwitz and Hiroshima, right? There's a way in which someone like Herman Kahn and someone like Adorno have points of agreement, and if you sketch those out, you've basically got consensus as to the first half of the 20th century. So yeah, and try to take off the IR in this image of this Adornian negative dialectic approach that I will later, that at the end of the book I propose myself. And yeah, I guess all my parts right together, so I've answered your question, I think, as best as I can. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. We have a follow-up question by Bill.
Sorry, I'm just trying to relate your presentation to Tim. So Tim said we should go down a neo-Marxist route, but there's much we learn from other traditions. So this is a pet peeve of mine, so I'm very blunt about this. It's not directed at you, but a lot of U.S. critical IR theory, there's no critique of capitalism, actually. If you read like Wendt or Daniel Dudney, people like this, that just is not there, it seems to me. So for Adorno, as you know, the critique of science, conceptual thought is tied to a critique of capitalism. It's critique of capitalism, there was nothing about that in your presentation, but that's somewhere else in the book. So how important is that to you in terms of this critique of, and of course people might worry about that critique of capitalism,
Right.
don't share
Right.
Adorno's. So are you going to bring that into the Canadians, critical IR people there do it, and in the UK they do it, in Europe they do it, in the US, my sense is no, that's not part of critical IR stuff. When I taught at University of Minnesota for a while, there wasn't a lot of critical political economy going on there.
Yeah, I think you're right. No, I'm not doing that in this work because that isn't actually how the work structures. There is a hard ontology to Adorno about the essential economic nature of what we think is political, about the culture industry, about the ability of the culture industry to obscure the reality from us. And for me to be doing IR and not national political sociology, I have to, quite early on in the book, divorce myself from that and say, yeah, okay, Adorno's going to do that. Adorno's going to say that that's the ontology. I don't think you can deal meaningfully with realism if you buy that wholeheartedly, right? I mean, then there is no prime conceivable. That also, right? So what I try to do is tread a mediate point where, yeah, that could be true, and these other ontologies could be true. And the reason that IR is IR, and not international global sociology, is that we admit the possibility of multiple ontologies, right? That the essentially political nature of the world could be the true one. We don't know. The essentially economic nature of the world could be the true one. We don't know.
Thank you. Do we have further questions? It seems we are, there's a certain tiredness.
The question is, what's for lunch?
Yeah. So, if there are no further questions, then maybe, yeah, Richard has a question, please. Richard, do I take the microphone? Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. So one more question.
This is a question, I enjoyed both papers. This question to Tim, a question I've always wanted to ask you, Tim, so let me take this occasion. And it certainly simplifies what you're writing, but it comes partly out of what Bill said and the way in which one situates critical theory and how you're doing it. As I understand Frankfurt School, the major concern would be emancipation, or at least an understanding of freedom from domination. Do you still think that concept, and I am simplifying what you're writing, so I'm really just asking you openly now, because there's been a lot of discussion here about the relationship between ethics and politics. Do you still see that crucial concept within the Frankfurt School as operative today, and how do you think you are mobilizing it at the moment?
Thanks, Richard, for that question. I think I heard most of it. To me, I think, yeah, there are varying understandings of emancipation, but I would believe that particularly now, the idea of how does the embedded inequality of the world, which has been somewhat occluded in the developed world for a while, maybe throughout the Cold War, definitely at the end of history moment, but I think for the past 5 or 6 years, it does seem apparent that there is a great deal of inequality in society, that with that inequality, there are those that are more caught in abject relations of domination, direction, than those who have some greater discretion to dominate them and direct them. So I think that some awareness, some consideration, some worry about inequality, domination, and then a project of emancipation is still very much, to me at least, on the agenda. I think that this is ignored too much, not only with regard to what maybe someone still considers the global South, but also within zones of domination, exploitation, or even just neglect are, to me, increasingly evident in many more places in the world.
Okay, thank you very much. So I cannot see any more questions at the moment. Then maybe wait another 5 seconds. And if not, you may maybe like to join me standing our appreciation.